I don't know if y'all knew this or not, but Fear Daily is not my only podcast. I actually started a show back in 2017 called Southern Gothic, and it's a nonfiction spooky podcast that explores the history behind some of the American South's darkest days, greatest mysteries, and most chilling ghost stories. Although, what I really like to tell folks is Southern Gothic is a show that takes some stories your mama or your peepaw told you growing up, and then we explore them from a historical perspective, diving down into how legends get made and who really are the folks at the heart of those old tall tales you might have heard. It really is a fun show to make, and I absolutely love doing it. So today, I'm going to bring you an episode of Southern Gothic for our feed swap Saturday. But I didn't just pick any old episode. No, I wanted to pick one that explores some themes that I think are really top of mind in the horror community right now. It's an episode called Robert Johnson's Deal with the Devil. And look, maybe you know exactly where this is going, and maybe you don't, but with the recent success of Ryan Coogler's Sinners, I thought more folks might be interested in diving deeper into one of the most notorious legends of the Delta Blues. A story that really did come right out of the same region of Mississippi that Sinners takes place in. Although, no, there aren't any vampires in this story. So y'all, if you enjoy this episode of Southern Gothic, I hope you'll go ahead and give us a follow on your favorite podcasting app because we've got lots more great stories to explore just like this one. So with that, let's head on down to the Delta for Robert Johnson's Deal with the Devil. The northwestern part of the state of Mississippi, bounded by the Mississippi River to the west and the Yazoo River to the east, is a distinct geographic and cultural region known as the Mississippi Delta. This truly unique part of the country boasts flat, expansive alluvial plains created by centuries of flooding and sediment deposits from the Mississippi River, resulting in some of the most fertile soil in the country, making it a historically important area for agriculture, particularly the farming of cotton. So as you might expect, it also has an unfortunate and complex history that includes slavery, sharecropping, and racial struggles with resulting issues that still resonate in these communities to this very day. But while this region may have severe socioeconomic disadvantages, culturally, the Mississippi Delta is as rich as they come. In fact, it's the proud birthplace of one of the few genres of music that can actually claim to be truly American-born, the Delta Blues. Defined particularly by its use of the guitar, early forms of the Delta Blues sprang up back in the late 19th and early 20th century as a vital form of expression for African Americans faced with severe challenges, searching for a means to cope with their daily struggles. Blending African musical traditions with American folk and spiritual songs, it's best characterized by its deeply expressive and often melancholic tone. Lyrics reflect themes of hardship, love, betrayal, and the desire for freedom and dignity with a stark honesty that hadn't really been expressed in song before. Early Delta blues musicians like Charlie Patton and Son House were often solo performers who played the guitar in a distinctly percussive manner, sometimes even using a slide to produce a wailing, haunting sound that has influenced the development of modern music more than those early performers who were often born into poverty with little opportunity, could have ever possibly imagined. However, not everyone down in the Delta viewed the blues so positively. Many saw it as morally dubious, dubbing it the devil's music, a perception that was not only fueled by the brash lyrical themes, but also the venues where blues was often played, places called juke joints. These informal and often rowdy establishments were spots where people gathered to dance, drink, and escape their troubles in a way that many of the God-fearing Christian folks in the Delta felt compromised the spiritual and moral values they held dear. Of course, this complex web of competing social values wasn't necessarily detrimental to the proliferation of the Delta blues. Rather, it likely catalyzed many of the myths and legends that helped shape this unique genre of music into what it is known for today. And of that mythic reputation, no legend is more notorious than the one surrounding a man named Robert Johnson, an individual who some say sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads in exchange for musical mastery. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. Juke joint on the outskirts of Banks, Mississippi was hopping on that fateful night in 1931 when Robert Johnson showed up with his guitar strapped to his back. Son House was on stage fueling the rowdy crowd with his aggressive slide guitar playing, and Willie Brown was at his side. When Son sang, his eyes rolled back and his head swayed. Folks say he was like a man possessed by the spirit when he performed, and on that night, it was no different. The eager crowd ate it up. So you can only imagine how intimidating it must have been for young Robert to approach him and ask for a chance to play. Now, Son House was pretty surprised himself when Robert walked in. After all, at this point, nobody had seen the young man in almost a year. Johnson had basically been laughed out of town by his heroes for his guitar playing, told he was noising people to death by Son and Willie. In fact, they wouldn't even let the boy pick up their instruments out of fear it'd break a string, but now Robert was back. Son House later claimed that when he saw him in the crowd that night, he leaned over to Willie and whispered with a grin, "Look who's coming in the door, got a guitar on his back." To which Willie responded with a chuckle, "Oh, that's little Robert." Then, when Johnson finally got up the nerve to approach the performers, Son ribbed him a little, just like he had for who knows how many times before. "What are you going to do with that thing?" he said, pointing at the guitar. "You can't do nothing with it." But Robert stood his ground. Something had changed in him since they last spoke almost a year before. "Let me have your seat," he said. Why Son House agreed, we'll never know, but he did, warning Robert that if he was going to get up in front of all those folks and take center stage, he damn well better do something with it. Well, y'all know what happened next, right? He damn well did. Robert Johnson played guitar like no one had ever heard before. He used a masterful finger-picking technique, incorporating his thumb to create a rich, layered texture that sounded like multiple instruments were playing simultaneously with an astounding rhythmic complexity and unconventional chord voicings to produce an otherworldly sound, made only more haunting by how deeply emotional and expressive he was. By the end of that first song, everyone in the Juke's jaws were on the floor, including Sunhouse and Willie Brown's. Robert then played a few more tunes, quite literally stealing the show before he strapped his guitar onto his back and headed out to begin his journey of becoming one of the most legendary and influential Delta bluesmen around. But as I said before, and you likely have already heard, that legend wasn't just due to his technical prowess on the guitar. Rather, it was how Robert Johnson got that good, because on that fateful night in Banks, Mississippi, folks weren't just in awe of his otherworldly playing, they were also shocked by the mystery of how he not only learned to do what he did, but how he got so good, so fast. It's a mystery that folks said could only be explained by one thing. Robert Johnson had sold his soul to the devil. You see, according to legend down in the Delta, if someone wanted to, say, acquire extraordinary musical talent, all they had to do was take their guitar down to the crossroads at midnight and wait for the devil to show. Then, when Old Scratch appeared, you just had to kneel down before him and hand your guitar over, at which point he would tune it and play a few songs before handing it back and disappearing. That's it. That's all you had to do, your soul in exchange for unmatched musical prowess, a deal that to this day people still claim Robert Johnson willingly entered into. And why wouldn't they? Because even though the guitar-picking virtuoso's life was cut short at the age of 27, leaving behind a meager recording catalog of only 29 songs, Robert Johnson is widely considered one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, a feat that is even more impressive when you consider he was, quote, noising people to death less than a decade before he himself passed. So the question is, how much of the legend of Robert Johnson and the Crossroads is a myth, and how much is real? Robert Leroy Johnson was born on May 8, 1911, in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. He was the son of Julia Minor and Noah Johnson, but Robert never knew his biological father, and by all accounts, Julia didn't really have much of a relationship with the man when Robert was conceived anyway. Back in 1889, when Julia was only about 13 or 14, she married Charles Dodds, and the couple had 10 children together, but in 1906, Charles had to flee Mississippi after getting into a dispute with a white man. Varying accounts of what happened have been told, but no matter the cause, as a black man living in rural Mississippi, even if Charles hadn't done anything wrong, violence was likely headed his way, so Dodds ended up settling not too far north in Memphis, Tennessee, where he changed his name to Charles Spencer. As you might expect, Julia struggled without Charles around, but he didn't shy away from his responsibilities, and as soon as each of those children was old enough to be without their mother, they went to live with Charles in Memphis. Yet that wasn't quite enough help, as sometime around 1910, Julia was evicted from her home and ended up homeless and hungry with 3 small children left to care for. That is when she met Noah Johnson. Julia and the 3 kids then moved into Johnson's small shack that was no larger than a modern-day garage, and while they didn't stay for long, it was there that Robert was conceived. To this day, what happened with his father Noah is a mystery, but what we do know is that with another child in tow, Julia's financial situation never improved, so by the time Robert was 3, she sent him and his sister Carrie to live with Charles in Memphis. Of course, Robert wasn't Charles's son, but he took the boy in to raise him alongside his siblings anyway. After all, Charles had built a fairly decent life for himself up in Memphis. He remarried and they had a place only a few blocks off of Beale Street. So you can imagine what young Robert Johnson was exposed to in these early years of his life. He was surrounded by music. Charles even played a few instruments himself and gave the boy his very first music lessons. Unfortunately, this comfortable life didn't last for long, as when Robert was only about 8 or 9 years old, his mother showed up to bring him back to Mississippi. Like many things in Robert Johnson's life, we'll never know exactly why this happened, but some say Charles felt Robert was getting to be too much of a handful for him, so he called Julia to come get him. However, what's more likely is that her new husband, a sharecropper named Dusty Willis, wanted the boy's help on the farm, picking cotton. Either way, this was quite the shock to young Robert, who, up until this point, believed that Charles was his biological father, and now, not only was he learning the truth about that, but he was also being ripped away from a life where he was receiving a proper education and was well fed and living comfortably with his siblings to go and toil in the hot Delta cotton fields for a man he didn't even know. This was very likely the first heartbreak that Robert Johnson endured, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. Eventually, the family ended up in Tunica County, Mississippi, where Robert was allowed to enroll in a one-room schoolhouse, but he was still expected to work the fields for Dusty, a fact that his stepfather truly loathed, and that became a real source of conflict for the pair, who frequently got into intense fights with each other that only grew worse as Robert got older. You see, Dusty purportedly resented Robert for his education and just wanted the boy to do what he was told, but Robert, well, he made it clear, quote, "I don't want to work. I'm trying to learn how to make my living without picking cotton. I got this here old guitar music on my mind, and that's what I want to learn more." According to his childhood friends, Robert was absolutely obsessed with music from the start, and I guess that ain't too surprising. They claimed that he would constantly be chugging away on a harmonica any chance he got, whether they were trying to fish or play marbles or whatever, but what he really wanted was to play the guitar. Unfortunately, those were expensive and he didn't exactly have any money. At first, he made himself a diddly bow, a rudimentary instrument typically made from found objects like broom wire, glass bottles, and cans. The way they do it is they'd stretch a string between 2 nails or screws on a wooden board, and then at the end, use the glass bottle as a bridge to amplify the sound. It wasn't the best in the world, but at that point, it's all that Robert had. Luckily, while his mother and stepfather might not have supported his passion, his sister Carrie did. Robert visited her and his family up in Memphis as often as he could, and Carrie not only helped Robert make his very first guitar out of a cigar box, but she even helped him start saving up pennies to purchase a real one, which he did right before his 16th birthday in 1927. It is said, though, that with the money he had, the guitar he got was missing a couple of strings. But that certainly didn't keep Robert Johnson from playing the remaining 4 non-stop, night and day, until he could save up to buy replacements for the others. It was then, at the age of 16, that Robert started sneaking out of the house at night to head down to the local jukes and watch folks like Willie Brown and Son House hold court. And to Robert, it was clear awful quick that this is what he wanted to do as well. This is how he'd escape the fields. He'd play the blues. Yet before that dream could become a reality, the now legendary musician had to endure even more tragedy and heartbreak. By 1928, Robert Johnson was playing on street corners, at house parties, and just about anywhere he could earn himself a little bit of extra money. At this point, he still wasn't even close to good enough on guitar to headline a juke like Son House, but he was a pretty versatile musician. He played harmonica, piano, pump organ, and the jaw harp, and he was a capable enough guitar player to play some old standards, folk music, a little ragtime and country. But as I said, he was nowhere close to good enough to fulfill his dream of playing the blues in packed jukes full of rowdy crowds. Before he'd get there, he had a few more lessons to learn, and one of the most difficult had nothing to do with guitar. At the age of 18, Robert fell in love with a 14-year-old girl named Virginia Travis, and for the first time in his life, he put aside his dream and focused on taking care of his new love. The pair wed not long after, both lying about their age on their marriage certificate, and the aspiring bluesman quit playing house parties and went back to farming. Soon enough, Virginia found out she was pregnant, and it seems as if Robert was absolutely thrilled by the news. But since they didn't have much family close by, as the time grew near for her to give birth, Virginia decided to go home to be with her family to help, leaving Robert to continue working the fields until the baby came, at which point he'd head up to meet his new child and celebrate with his wife. That was the plan, but what happened next likely became a source of guilt that plagued him for the rest of his life. With Virginia gone, Robert decided to pick up his guitar and head back out into the music scene. Now look, he probably never stopped playing entirely anyway, and could have just figured that this was a way to earn a little extra money on his way up to see his wife and greet his new child. On the other hand, as some have suggested, the lure of the blues might just have been a little too strong for him to contend with on his own, and he just couldn't hold out any longer. Either way, what happened, happened. When Robert finally arrived at the door of Virginia's family home, guitar in hand, he was informed that both his beautiful young wife and the precious child she gave birth to had died. And if that wasn't enough to torment the young man's soul, Virginia's family made it very clear that they blamed him for what had happened, that he had brought the wrath of God down on Virginia by immersing himself in what they deemed was the devil's music. Now, y'all, I know I already briefly mentioned the stigma that the blues had down in the Mississippi Delta region, but I'm not sure how deep I really made it seem. Even without the lure of the crossroads, the life of a bluesman was not exactly a reputable career choice. For the most part, these largely African-American Southern communities were deeply religious, and the blues, with its lyrical themes of rebellion, hardship, and overt sexuality, challenged that. Not to mention the intensity of the music itself and its rhythmic foundation were in direct contrast to traditional spiritual and folk music, making it even feel as if you were doing something wrong just by listening. Of course, if you top that off with the lifestyle many blues musicians led as hedonistic womanizers who traveled from town to town drinking and gambling, it's no wonder why folks in these deeply conservative and religious communities thought what Virginia's grieving family thought. Blues music was a product of the devil himself. You have to wonder, though, what did Robert think as he mourned the death of his wife and newborn child? Did he feel guilt for not being there when it happened, or did he possibly believe that the devil really did have a hand in what transpired due to his choices? We will never know, but what we do know is that after this tragedy, Robert was ready to chase his dream full force, and not only was he not going to let anyone get in his way, but soon enough, he'd embrace that devil-may-care stereotype that came with the profession. But first, with Virginia gone, Robert moved back in with his mother and stepfather, a situation that did not go so well because Dusty still thought he should be able to use Robert as labor on the farm, and when Robert resisted, Dusty got violent, and when Dusty got violent, Robert rambled, leaving home for days and weeks at a time. It was then that Robert Johnson met Son House for the first time at a juke in Robinsonville, Mississippi. In an interview over 3 decades later, Son House reminisced on that encounter.
He was just a little boy then. He blew a harmonica and he was pretty good with that, but he wanted to play guitar. His mother and stepfather didn't like for him to go out to those Saturday night balls because the guys were so rough, but he'd slip away anyway. Sometimes he'd even wait until his mother went to bed, and then he'd get out the window and make it to where we were. He'd sit right down on the floor and watch from one to the other. And when we'd get a break and want to rest some, we'd set the guitars up in the corner and go out in the cool air. Robert would watch and see which way we'd gone, and he would pick up one of them guitars up, and such a racket you never heard. It'd make people mad, you know.
All right, now look, by all accounts, folks say Son House was probably exaggerating a little as to how bad Robert Johnson really was on guitar when they first met, but he certainly wasn't ready to steal Son and Willie Seach just yet. And after getting pushed around and teased a little by his seniors, he went and spent some time up in Memphis and helped the Spencer family move before making an important decision for himself. With absolutely nowhere to go and practically no one to turn to, the young man decided it was time to head back to his birthplace of Hazelhurst, Mississippi, and try to find his biological father, Noah Johnson. Well, the trip would prove to be a failure when it came to that. No one had heard or seen Noah Johnson in years, but what Robert Johnson did find in Hazelhurst changed the course of American music for who knows how many generations to come. And no, y'all, it ain't the devil. Well, at least as far as we know. It was a man named Ike Zimmerman. Robert first encountered Ike one night when he heard him playing at a joint down in Hazelhurst and was absolutely blown away. He thought Ike was the greatest sounding guitar player he'd ever heard. Johnson was enamored by how Ike alternated between fingerpicking and bottleneck slides, so naturally he went and introduced himself. Unlike many of the bluesmen that Johnson had met before, Isaiah Ike Zimmerman was a family man. He was married and had 7 children. As such, he was likely a bit paternal to young Robert and probably recognized pretty quickly that the boy was, for lack of a better term, at a crossroads in life. So he invited the young guitar player to stay with him and his family as long as he needed to, and Robert not only did just that, but he also began soaking up and learning absolutely everything that Ike Zimmerman could teach him about their craft. So you see, that legendary meeting at the crossroads that Robert Johnson supposedly had with the devil? Well, that man was likely nothing more than this gentle, father-like figure who offered to teach him everything he knew. Then again, the circumstances surrounding how Ike taught him might be just as wild as the idea of hanging with the devil at midnight. Retired professor Bruce Conforth and author of Up Jumped the Devil, The Real Life of Robert Johnson, described Ike's unique way of giving guitar lessons simply.
Ike always said the only way to learn how to play the blues was to sit on a gravestone at midnight in a cemetery. And then the haints, which is a southern word for ghosts or spirits, would come out and they would teach you how to play the blues.
You heard that right. Ike Zimmerman would take young Robert Johnson out to the Beauregard Cemetery just south of Hazelhurst, where the two men would sit under the stars on a pair of headstones, facing each other so Ike could show Robert everything he knew about guitar playing. All the while, a marble statue overlooked them as they picked away into the night. This is how Robert Johnson became the masterful player who showed up on that fateful night in Banks, Mississippi, an entirely new man. And while this story might not be quite as dramatic as selling your soul to the devil at the crossroads, it ain't too shabby when it comes to building a myth. Something you'll soon see Robert did not shy away from. In interviews decades later, one of Ike's daughters, Laretha Zimmerman, verified that her dad really did go practice guitar down at the cemetery, although she said the truth was he went there because it was quiet and he wouldn't disturb anyone with his playing. The ghost part was more of a dad joke than anything.
Daddy would always scare people and say he'd go pick him a guitar and the Haints would come out at the graveyard. He'd come back and tell us he'd played for the Haints, but he wasn't meeting the devil.
In spite of all of these lessons and the time spent practicing, there was one final sacrifice that Robert Johnson would have to make before heading back home to the Delta and becoming the bluesman we know today. And it wasn't selling his soul. It was yet another heartbreak. While down in Hazelhurst, Robert fell in love once again, this time to a 16-year-old girl named Virgie Jane Smith. But here's the thing. Virgie's parents were devout Christians, and they forbade her from listening to the blues. It was the devil's music, they said. But y'all know how that goes, right? That just meant the teen would sneak out to go see her new love play, and that worked for a while. But eventually, they couldn't hide their relationship any longer because Robert got Virgie pregnant. By all accounts, he seemed to genuinely love her, and he wanted to do the right thing and take care of her, and he even asked her to leave town with him, but Virgie turned him down. She knew that her parents would disown her. After all, he was a musician who played the devil's music, and the family's disdain for that was so intense that after the child was born, they wouldn't even take Robert's money to help raise him because of how he made that money. So now, playing the blues, it not only cost Robert Johnson the love of two women, but also two sons. he was never even given a chance to be a part of his and Virgie's child's life, a boy named Claude. Yet Robert did not stop playing. In fact, he dug his heels in even more and once again rededicated himself completely to the very thing that had stolen all he had loved. And this time, he'd embraced the stigma and stereotype of a man who sold his soul to the devil. After all, if they're going to say he did, he'd just as soon play the part. The night that Robert Johnson made his triumphant return to the Delta and shocked everyone with his new skills, Son House made sure to give him one important piece of advice before he hit the road. He told him, quote, "You have to be careful because you mighty crazy about the girls." You see, Son knew what life was like out there for a traveling bluesman, and after watching Robert in front of the crowd and realizing how popular he was going to get, the veteran guitar player was mighty concerned that Johnson was liable to get himself killed if he hooked up with the wrong woman. Sadly, it doesn't seem as if the young man listened to this advice, and if he did, he didn't care. Following that now historic performance that fueled the legend of the Crossroads, Robert took off to travel all over the country, hoboing up and down Highway 61 and playing music in jukes and performance halls in places like Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. He even made it all the way up to Canada. Sometimes he was accompanied by other musicians like Johnny Shines, and sometimes he played solo. But wherever he went, Robert Johnson seemed to draw large crowds. The legend was growing, and he did very little to discourage it. He never went to church, he did not pray, never sang religious music, enjoyed the company of many women, and most of all, if you listen to the lyrics of his songs, there's no doubt he was leaning into the stigma. According to Dr. Yvonne Chareau, a professor of religion and author of the book Black Magic, Religion and the African American Conjuring Tradition, this image that Johnson was shrouded in had deeper roots than what you might expect.
The story of Robert Johnson going down to the crossroads and making a bargain with the devil, I think it's reflecting on a tradition in African American folklore called hoodoo, African American styles of magic. And hoodoo has these stories of people going to a crossroad and meeting up with an entity who offers some sort of insight or knowledge to learn all kinds of things. So hoodoo was seen as a way of gaining control in a world that was suffused by violence and limited options. Hoodoo gave people other possibilities for living in that world.
References to hoodoo and the black man's struggle in the Jim Crow South are scattered all throughout Johnson's catalog. In songs like Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, Come On In My Kitchen, and Me and the Devil Blues. Hellhound on My Trail includes a particularly interesting example as Robert alludes to something called hot foot powder, singing, "You sprinkled hot foot powder all around your daddy's door." Well, you see, in hoodoo, hot foot powder is like a low-grade hex used to cause short-term suffering. However, this line also has racial connotations, as it was well known that African Americans would use something called hot powder to evade bloodhounds when fleeing a lynch mob. It was a concoction of various spices and herbs. In the song, though, Johnson doesn't say hot powder. He specifically says hot foot powder, and he also doesn't say bloodhounds. He says hellhounds. So yeah, he knew what he was doing as a songwriter, using wordplay to invoke multiple meanings. Another often cited example of this is the song Come On In My Kitchen, where he sings, "She's gone, I know she won't come back. I've taken that last nickel out of her nation sack." A nation sack was a bag that women practicing hoodoo used to wear on a belt around their waist, and it gave them sexual power and control over men. So by removing the last nickel from the sack, the man freed himself from her control and could invite whoever he wanted into his, kitchen. As I said, Robert Johnson did not shy away from leaning into that devil-may-care lifestyle, and in the end, it was as if Son House knew the future, because after a while, the soon-to-be king of the Delta Blues got a bit bolder in his pursuit of women. On August 13th, 1938, Robert was playing at a dance in a place called the Three Forks, a store near Greenwood, Mississippi. While down there, he met a woman named Beatrice Davis who was married to a local farmer named Ralph. But that didn't stop Robert from starting up an affair with her, and the two began to sneak around town together. Of course, the husband eventually discovered what was going on behind his back and decided to take matters into his own hands. So on that hot night in August at around 11 p.m., the jealous husband gave an unsuspecting Beatrice a jar of corn liquor in which he had dissolved several mothballs, knowing full well should give it to Johnson. This mostly tasteless, colorless, and odorless ingredient was known as a passagreen back then in the rural South, but today it's called naphthalene. It's a chemical sometimes used in dyes and insecticides. Now, normally, ingesting this chemical was rarely fatal. It would have just made Robert confused and given him some intestinal distress, but what Davis did not know was that the guitar player had recently been diagnosed with an ulcer, and he was also suffering from esophageal varices, which were enlarged veins in the esophagus, likely caused by drinking too much alcohol. As a result, the mixture that Davis gave to Beatrice that night to teach her boyfriend a lesson would prove fatal. Like everything in Robert's life, there are a number of different tellings as to what exactly went down. One was that Sonny Boy Williams saw Robert pick up that bottle of open whiskey and he swatted it out of his hand, warning him not to drink from an already open bottle, but Robert just retorted, "Don't ever knock a $7 bottle of whiskey out of my hand," before proceeding to drink. Honey Boy Edwards, who was supposed to be playing with Robert that night, said they found Robert already in a stupor when they got there and quickly knew that something just wasn't right.
"We was all high, ready to ball all night long. When we got there, Robert was sitting in a corner with his guitar under his arm. He was sick. And the women jumped off the truck, come in and said to him, 'Play me Terraplane Blues.' Robert said, 'I'm sick.' And they said, 'Have a drink of whiskey. Have another drink and you'll feel all right.' But Robert had got poisoned. All the folks kept on hollering, 'Play.' He tried to play once or twice, but couldn't and said, 'I'm sick, I can't play.' And they took him and laid him across a bed in the back room.
Later that evening, someone brought Robert back to where he was staying in Greenwood, but he was just left there alone to languish in pain. The next day, some folks came to visit him, but they said when they got there, he was howling like a dog and bleeding at the mouth. It seemed that the poison had caused his ulcer and varices to hemorrhage, and he languished for 2 long days until he died in the early hours of August 16th, 1938. He was only 27 years old. What is truly the most shocking part of Robert Johnson's career, though, is that for as mighty of an impact as he had on American music, there's very little he left behind in the way of evidence that he ever even lived. There's only 2 photos, no footage, and a mere 29 songs recorded over a period of 5 days. These recordings, which would later be referenced as highly influential by legendary musicians like Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, and Jimmy Page, were captured at a pair of makeshift recording studios down in Texas less than 2 years before he died. Yet his impact is undeniable, whether it's due to the legend that surrounded him or the unique way he played, creating rhythmic bass lines with his thumb while finger-picking counter melodies in a way never before heard. It was a truly astonishing technique for the time, and it is no wonder why folks actually believe that Robert Johnson had sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. In 1986, Robert Johnson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the institution's first class, alongside iconic performers Ray Charles, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. And while the legend that he sold his soul to the devil persists, whether it is true or not, well, Keb Mo put it best when he said, "I don't know where the crossroads story came from, but I believe in my core. Even if Robert Johnson actually met the devil, even if it really happened, then it's a metaphor, a wake-up call for a person to go ahead and become who they are." My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. Southern Gothic is an independent podcast produced by Southern Gothic Media. This week's episode was researched by Loretta Allen, written by Brandon Schexnayder, and ultimately made possible through the support of listeners like you. If you're a fan of the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcasting app. And of course, if you'd like access to ad-free versions as well as periodic premium episodes, check the show notes for links to various platforms, including Patreon and the Into History podcast channel. Y'all, I can't say it enough. Thanks for listening.
Lucky Little Shack.